In the year 550 CE, a young woman crossed the borders of two empires, carrying a secret worth more than all the gold in Constantinople. Hidden somewhere on her person, concealed within the elaborate folds of her traveling attire, were tiny eggs that would shatter the greatest monopoly the ancient world had ever known. If discovered, she would face immediate execution. Her name has been deliberately erased from nearly every historical record. But what she accomplished in that single act of espionage would reshape global economics for the next 1,000 years and prove that one determined individual could bring an empire to its knees without ever drawing a sword. This isn't a legend or a romanticized tale. This is the story of industrial espionage so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it changed the balance of power between East and West forever. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why her identity was systematically scrubbed from history and why the consequences of her actions are still affecting the clothes you're wearing right now. But here's what they don't want you to know. The woman who broke China's 3,000-year monopoly wasn't a trained spy. She was a political bride sent to marry into a foreign dynasty as a living treaty. And the method she used to smuggle out the most valuable biological secret in human history was so simple, so elegant, that when the truth finally emerged centuries later, historians couldn't believe it had worked. Our story begins in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, in the legendary city of Constantinople, where Emperor Justinian the Great sat on a throne surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet found himself bleeding his treasury dry for a single luxury his empire could not produce: silk. Picture the scene. The year is 540 CE, and the Byzantine court glitters with a splendor that would make modern billionaires weep with envy. Marble columns soar toward gilded ceilings. Mosaics made from millions of glass tiles catch the light from hundreds of oil lamps. Courtiers draped in purple silk, the color reserved exclusively for imperial use, move through halls where the very air seems heavy with incense and power. At the center of this magnificence sits Justinian, arguably the most powerful man in the Western world, architect of legal codes that would shape European law for 1,500 years, commander of armies that had reconquered North Africa and Italy. But Justinian had a problem that no amount of military might could solve. Every ounce of silk that adorned his courtiers, every shimmering banner that hung in his churches, every luxurious bolt of fabric that demonstrated Byzantine wealth and sophistication came from China. And China made the Byzantine Empire pay in gold. Literal rooms filled with gold coins, shipped eastward along the Silk Road in an endless hemorrhage of wealth that was slowly bankrupting even the richest empire in the Mediterranean world. Here's what made this situation different from ordinary trade imbalances. Silk wasn't just expensive, it was worth more per ounce than gold itself. A single bolt of high-quality Chinese silk could cost the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman might earn in 5 years. Byzantine merchants who successfully completed the dangerous journey along the Silk Road could retire as wealthy men from a single expedition. But the real wealth stayed in China, where the secret of silk production had been guarded with fanatical devotion for 3 millennia. Imagine being the ruler of what you believe to be the civilized world's greatest empire, possessing legions of soldiers, controlling the Mediterranean Sea, commanding the loyalty of millions, yet being utterly dependent on a distant empire for a luxury that has become essential to your court's prestige. Every diplomatic reception, every church ceremony, every demonstration of imperial power required silk, and every yard of it represented gold flowing out of your treasury into the hands of Chinese merchants who laughed all the way to their own emperor's coffers. But here's the fascinating part. It wasn't just about money, though the economic drain was staggering. Silk had become woven into the very fabric of Byzantine identity. The purple silk of imperial robes wasn't merely decoration, it was a sacred symbol of divine authority. Church vestments made from silk connected the earthly church to heavenly glory. Diplomatic gifts of silk could seal alliances or signal favor. To be dependent on a foreign power for something so fundamental to Byzantine prestige was a strategic vulnerability that kept Justinian's advisors awake at night. Contemporary chroniclers reported that Justinian became obsessed with finding a solution. He consulted with merchants, interrogated travelers, offered enormous rewards for anyone who could reveal the secret of silk production. What he learned only made the situation seem more hopeless. The Chinese didn't just guard the technique of silk making. They had made revealing it a capital crime, punishable by death in ways designed to serve as horrifying examples to anyone who might be tempted by foreign gold. The secret itself seemed almost mythological. Silk came from worms. Not earthworms, but specialized caterpillars that fed exclusively on mulberry leaves and spun cocoons made from a single continuous thread that could stretch for nearly a mile. These silkworms, properly called Bomix mori, had been domesticated by the Chinese for so long that they no longer existed in the wild. They couldn't fly, they couldn't even feed themselves properly. They had been transformed through millennia of selective breeding into living silk factories, completely dependent on human care. But to obtain these creatures, to learn the intricate techniques of sericulture, to discover which mulberry varieties produce the best silk, to master the timing of harvest and the methods of thread extraction, all of this was locked behind borders patrolled by guards who would kill on sight anyone attempting to smuggle out silkworm eggs. The Chinese had turned biological knowledge into a weapon of economic warfare, and for 3,000 years, that weapon had been absolutely effective. What Justinian created wasn't just an empire. It was a civilization that saw itself as the inheritor of Rome's glory, the defender of Christianity, the light of learning in a world sliding toward darkness. But even the most magnificent civilization has vulnerabilities, and Justinian understood that his dependence on Chinese silk was a weakness that could be exploited by enemies, and was certainly being exploited by Chinese merchants who charged whatever prices they wished. This brings us to the decision that would change everything, and the woman whose name we will never know. The year was 547 CE, and in the complex world of medieval diplomacy, marriages were weapons as powerful as armies. Young women of noble birth were routinely sent to foreign courts to seal alliances, create bonds between ruling families, and serve as living symbols of peace between potentially hostile empires. These women were expected to be beautiful, educated, cultured, and absolutely loyal to their families and homelands. Justinian's diplomatic corps identified an opportunity. A Central Asian kingdom that maintained relations with both the Byzantine Empire and China's Northern Wei dynasty was arranging a marriage alliance. A Byzantine noblewoman, raised in the sophistication of Constantinople's court, trained in languages and diplomatic protocol, would be sent eastward as a bride. Her journey would take her along the Silk Road, through territories where East met West, and eventually into regions where the secrets of silk production might be learned. What Byzantine intelligence services understood, but what most people today don't realize, is that women in these arranged marriages often had unique access to information. They entered the private spaces of foreign palaces. They formed relationships with servants and craftspeople. They had years, sometimes decades, to observe and learn. And because they were women, they were often underestimated, dismissed as decorative additions to diplomatic arrangements rather than potential intelligence assets. But here's what made this particular princess different. We don't know her name. We don't know her family. We don't even know for certain which kingdom she was sent to marry into, and that erasure from history wasn't accidental. It was deliberate protection, either by Byzantine officials who wanted to safeguard her identity from Chinese retaliation, or possibly by Chinese authorities who were so humiliated by what she accomplished that they tried to erase all evidence of their failure. What we do know comes from fragmentary accounts written decades later by Byzantine historians who had heard the story from court officials. A young woman of remarkable intelligence was sent eastward. Her mission wasn't explicitly to steal silk secrets. Such a dangerous objective probably wasn't given to her directly. But she was educated about the economic importance of silk, about the desperate need for the empire to break free from Chinese monopoly, and about the potential value of any information she could gather. Picture this remarkable woman's journey. Leaving behind the marble grandeur of Constantinople, she traveled for months along routes where Byzantine influence gradually faded and Central Asian cultures emerged. She crossed deserts where caravans could go weeks without reliable water. She traversed mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold. She entered cities where the languages changed, where the food became unfamiliar, where everything about daily life shifted until she might have felt she'd left the known world entirely. and then she entered her new life as a foreign bride in a kingdom that had extensive trade relationships with China. Contemporary accounts suggest she spent years in this role. Not months, not a brief visit, but years of patient observation, of building relationships, of learning languages, of carefully gathering information that would have seemed insignificant to anyone who didn't understand what they were looking for. Here's the fascinating part. Sericulture wasn't a single secret. It was an entire system of agricultural and craft knowledge. You needed to know which species of mulberry tree to cultivate. You needed to understand the life cycle of the silkworm in precise detail, because harvesting the cocoons at the wrong time could ruin the silk. You needed to master the techniques for killing the pupae inside the cocoons without damaging the silk thread, for unwinding that thread in hot water, for twisting multiple threads together to create usable silk yarn, for dyeing and weaving the final product. What this nameless princess accomplished was learning all of it. Somehow, over years of patient observation, she pieced together the complete picture of silk production. She identified which merchants had access to silkworm eggs. She learned when those eggs were dormant and could survive travel. She discovered the methods for keeping them alive without refrigeration, without specialized equipment, using only materials that would be available on a journey lasting months. But the real crisis was how to smuggle this knowledge and the precious living cargo out of regions where Chinese commercial interests maintained vigilant watch. The Silk Road wasn't a single road. It was a network of trade routes monitored by merchants whose fortunes depended on maintaining China's monopoly. Any unusual interest in sericulture would be reported. Any attempt to purchase silkworm eggs would trigger immediate investigation. And any foreign noblewoman caught with such contraband would face execution, diplomatic status be damned. If you're still here, this story is about to take a turn that demonstrates just how audacious this operation really was. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you that the greatest heists in history weren't about stealing gold or jewels. They were about stealing knowledge that could reshape civilization itself. So stay tuned. By the early 550s CE, the princess had learned everything she needed. She had identified sources for silkworm eggs. She had memorized the techniques of sericulture. She had, through careful cultivation of relationships, and possibly through substantial bribes, obtained a quantity of silkworm eggs during their dormant period, when they resembled nothing more than tiny specks of rice. Now came the moment that would require more courage than any battlefield heroism. She had to smuggle these eggs across borders where discovery meant death, past checkpoints where Chinese commercial agents examined cargo, through territories where merchants might recognize what she carried and either confiscate it or kill her to protect their trade interests. The accounts vary on exactly how she accomplished this. Some Byzantine chronicles claim she hid the eggs in a hollow bamboo walking staff, sealed at both ends, that she carried as part of her traveling equipment. Bamboo was common along the Silk Road, and a noblewoman's decorative staff would excite no particular interest. Other accounts suggest she concealed the eggs in the elaborate headdress that noble women wore, tucked among the fabric and decorative elements, where guards would be reluctant to search too thoroughly. Touching a noblewoman's clothing or person could mean severe punishment. What we know for certain is that she succeeded where dozens of previous attempts by male merchants and spies had failed. She crossed back toward Byzantine-controlled territory, carrying biological contraband, so valuable that its worth literally exceeded its weight in gold by several orders of magnitude. Imagine the journey. Weeks of travel with every checkpoint representing a potential death sentence. Every interaction with merchants who made their fortunes from silk trade. Every night wondering if informants had reported her interest in sericulture to Chinese agents. Every inspection of luggage, every curious question, every moment of heightened attention from guards or officials. One thorough search, one suspicious inspector, one informant's report, and everything would be lost. Not just her mission, but her life. When the princess finally reached Constantinople, probably sometime between 550 and 552 CE, she carried with her something no Byzantine had ever possessed: living silkworm eggs and the complete knowledge necessary to transform them into an industry. What happened next would demonstrate that Justinian hadn't just been desperate for silk, he'd been preparing for this exact opportunity. Imperial workshops were quickly established in the palace complex itself, under guard in absolute secrecy. The princess, whose name we will never know, personally supervised the first generation of Byzantine sericulture. Mulberry trees were planted in palace gardens. The tiny silkworms that hatched from those smuggled eggs were tended with obsessive care. And when they spun their cocoons and Byzantine craftspeople successfully unwound silk thread for the first time in Western history, it marked an economic victory as significant as any military conquest Justinian's legions had achieved. But here's what most people don't understand. The immediate impact wasn't that Byzantium suddenly started producing cheap silk for everyone. Sericulture remained a carefully guarded secret, this time protected by Byzantine authorities who understood exactly how valuable it was. The initial production was small, reserved exclusively for imperial use. The real victory was strategic. Byzantium was no longer completely dependent on China. They now had leverage in negotiations with Chinese merchants. They could refuse extortionate prices. They could start building their own silk industry that would, over the following decades, grow into a major economic force. Contemporary accounts describe Emperor Justinian's reaction when the first Byzantine-produced silk was presented to him. He reportedly held the shimmering fabric in his hands, understanding that what he held represented not just beautiful cloth, but freedom from economic servitude. The empire that had been bleeding gold to China could now staunch that wound. More than that, they could eventually become competitors in the silk market, exporting their own product and reclaiming some of the wealth that had flowed eastward for so long. The Byzantine silk industry grew rapidly under imperial patronage. Within a decade, multiple workshops were operating. Within a generation, Byzantine silk began to appear in Western European markets. Within a century, Byzantine silk was considered equal in quality to Chinese silk, and in some designs, particularly those incorporating Christian imagery and Mediterranean aesthetic sensibilities, it was actually preferred by European buyers. Let me explain why this matters far beyond ancient economics. What this nameless princess accomplished was one of the earliest recorded examples of successful industrial espionage. She broke a 3,000-year-old monopoly not through military force, not through trade negotiations, but through the patient acquisition and transfer of technological knowledge. She proved that information could be more valuable than armies. She demonstrated that underestimated individuals, particularly women dismissed as mere diplomatic ornaments, could accomplish strategic objectives that male spies and merchants had failed to achieve despite repeated attempts. This was just the beginning of silk's transformation from an exclusive luxury to a commodity that would eventually be produced around the world. The knowledge that the princess smuggled out of Central Asia didn't stay confined to Byzantine workshops. Over the following centuries, it spread to Islamic caliphates, to Italy, to France, eventually to virtually every region with suitable climate for mulberry cultivation. The monopoly that China had maintained for 3 millennia was broken forever, and it started with one woman's courage and one carefully concealed cache of silkworm eggs. When the full scope of what had happened finally became clear, the reaction from Chinese commercial interests ranged from disbelief to fury. Merchants who had built fortunes on silk trade suddenly faced competition. Chinese emperors who had used silk as a diplomatic tool found that tool's effectiveness dramatically reduced. The economic weapon that had extracted wealth from the Western world for centuries had been neutralized by what Chinese chroniclers, in the rare accounts that mention the incident at all, describe as theft and treachery. But the most shocking part of this story is what happened to the woman who made it all possible. Her name was erased, not forgotten through the natural erosion of time, but deliberately removed from records. Byzantine sources refer to her only as the princess or a certain noblewoman. Chinese sources, in the few that acknowledge the loss of silk monopoly at all, never mention her. Later Islamic historians who described the spread of sericulture throughout the Mediterranean world treated it as if the knowledge had somehow appeared spontaneously in Constantinople, with no human agent responsible. This wasn't accidental. Byzantine authorities had strong motivation to protect her identity. If Chinese agents could identify her or her family, retaliation was certain. Even decades after the fact, revealing her name could endanger relatives who remained in Central Asian kingdoms that maintained diplomatic relations with China. The erasure of her identity was a security measure, a final act of protection for someone who had served her empire with extraordinary effectiveness. But there's a darker interpretation that historians today are increasingly willing to consider. Perhaps the erasure wasn't protection. Perhaps it was something more sinister. A woman who had proven herself capable of such effective espionage, who had demonstrated the ability to deceive foreign courts for years, who had successfully smuggled out the most valuable secret in the ancient world, such a woman might seem dangerous to keep around, even in her home empire. What if she was eliminated after delivering her precious cargo, precisely because she was too capable, too dangerous, too knowledgeable about methods and techniques that Byzantine intelligence wanted to keep secret? We will never know the truth. What we do know is that within a generation of silk production beginning in Constantinople, all specific details about how that production started had become suspiciously vague in official histories. The story became legend, became myth, became almost folkloric in its lack of concrete detail. And at the center of that story, where there should have been a named hero receiving honors and rewards, there was only a blank space where a woman's identity used to be. Over the following decades, as Byzantine silk workshops expanded and Chinese merchants watched their profits evaporate, the full consequences of one woman's espionage became clear. This wasn't just about fabric. It was about the fundamental restructuring of Eurasian economics. Trade routes that had been dominated by silk caravans now carried different goods. Empires that had been enriched by silk monopoly had to find new sources of revenue. Technologies that had been guarded as state secrets became, gradually and then rapidly, common knowledge. Here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its irony. The very thing that made China's silk monopoly so effective, the absolute secrecy, the death penalties, the centuries of successful concealment, made it incredibly vulnerable once that secrecy was broken. China had no backup plan. They had become so confident in their monopoly that they hadn't developed other luxury industries to the same level. When silk became available from Byzantine and later Islamic sources, the Chinese economy, particularly in silk-producing regions, faced devastating disruption. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, found that silk production gave them exactly the economic flexibility that Justinian had hoped for. They could produce purple imperial silk that was forbidden to others, reinforcing imperial prestige. They could export lower grades to European kingdoms, earning gold that had previously flowed to China. They could use high-quality silk as diplomatic gifts without worrying about supply. The economic power that had bled them for centuries now worked in their favor. But the most shocking part wasn't the economic shift. It was the systematic effort to erase the human agent who made it all possible. As generations passed and Byzantine silk production became routine, the dramatic story of how it started became embellished with supernatural elements. Some later accounts claimed that Christian monks, not a princess, had smuggled out the silkworm eggs. Other versions suggested that the knowledge had been a divine gift, revealed through miraculous means. The more mythological the story became, the further it moved from the historical reality of a brave, intelligent woman who risked her life to break an economic stranglehold. By the medieval period, when European scholars wrote about the origins of Byzantine silk, they treated the story as legend rather than history. The details had become so corrupted, so mixed with fictional elements, that serious historians dismissed the entire account as fabrication. It wasn't until the 20th century, when scholars began carefully comparing fragmentary sources and analyzing the economic history of silk production, that the core truth emerged from beneath centuries of mythmaking and deliberate obscuration. For over 1,400 years, the woman who broke China's silk monopoly existed only as a ghost in historical records, a nameless figure whose accomplishments were attributed to others, whose courage was forgotten, whose very existence was questioned by skeptical historians who couldn't believe that medieval sources describing a female spy could be accurate. It wasn't until recent decades that feminist historians and researchers focusing on women's hidden roles in history began to piece together the fragments, cross-referencing Byzantine, Chinese, and Persian sources, analyzing the timeline of silk production's spread, examining the economic motivations and political context. And gradually, the story came back into focus. Not her name, which seems to be permanently lost, but the recognition that what had been dismissed as legend was actually history, and that the legend had been deliberately created to obscure a truth that made powerful men uncomfortable. Today, as we recover lost women's history and challenge narratives that have systematically erased female achievement, we're not just correcting historical records. We're confronting questions about who gets remembered and why. The princess who smuggled silk secrets accomplished something that shaped global economics for centuries. Her achievement affected the wealth of empires, the development of trade routes, the spread of technologies, and the balance of power between East and West. Yet she was deemed so dangerous, or so unimportant, or so uncomfortable to acknowledge that her name was stripped from every record. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth that most histories still don't fully acknowledge. The erasure wasn't random. It followed a pattern repeated across cultures and centuries. Women who demonstrate exceptional capability in fields dominated by men are either attributed their achievements to male figures, or are erased entirely, or are transformed into mythical characters whose stories become so exaggerated that they're dismissed as fiction. The Byzantine princess's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about whose achievements we preserve and whose we allow to be forgotten. How many other women accomplished extraordinary things in the medieval world only to have their names deliberately removed from records? How many scientific discoveries, diplomatic triumphs, acts of espionage, or strategic victories have been attributed to men because the true agents were women whose contributions made male leaders uncomfortable? Modern historians estimate that silk production, which began in China around 3000 BCE, would have remained a Chinese monopoly well into the modern era, if not for that transfer of knowledge in the 6th century CE. The economic history of Europe and the Mediterranean world would have developed along fundamentally different paths. The wealth that fueled the Byzantine Empire's cultural achievements and military campaigns would have continued to drain eastward. The Renaissance might have been delayed or diminished without the luxury textile industry that helped fund artistic and cultural development. All of this, traceable back to one woman whose name we will never know. The Byzantine princess reminds us that greatness can emerge from unexpected places, that the most powerful weapons aren't always military ones, and that courage takes many forms. She also reminds us that even the most magnificent achievements can be lost, erased, or forgotten if we don't actively work to preserve them and question the narratives that have been handed down to us. Her legacy endures in every bolt of silk produced outside China, in every textile industry that grew from the knowledge she transferred, in every example of industrial espionage that followed the pattern she established. More importantly, her story endures as a reminder that history is written by those in power, but the truth is often more extraordinary than the official records suggest, and sometimes the most important historical figures are the ones whose names have been deliberately erased. If this story opened your eyes to how much women's history has been systematically hidden or erased, hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten histories that change the world. Let me know in the comments what other historical figures you think deserve to have their stories rescued from obscurity. The truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it and be willing to question whose version of history you've been told. Because somewhere in the historical record, preserved only as a certain princess, or a noblewoman whose name is not recorded, is a woman who brought an empire to its knees with nothing more than courage, intelligence, and a handful of tiny eggs. And the fact that we don't know her name says more about how history is written than about how history actually happened.